This celebratory program was originally planned for our April League of Women Voters of Sanibel 2020 annual meeting. But you know what happened. The times caused us to cancel that. So we really have missed seeing all of you and hope that you are truly staying safe, staying healthy at home or wherever you are. As you can see by our program coming up, this program is a celebration of 100 years of women's suffrage, 100 years of the League of Women Voter, and the 10th anniversary of our League of Women Voters of Sanibel. Take a closer look at the cast of characters and the people who are playing the characters. I'm going to read them to you. Abigail Adams is played by Robin Kravanek. Sojourner Truth by Diane Spears. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, played by Ellen O'Neill. Frederick Douglass, played by Judge Archie Hayward. Susan B. Anthony is played by Chris Schluter. Mary Ann Shad Carey by Geraldine Ware. Dr. Anna Julia Cooper by Gwen Bates. Ida B. Wells Barnett by Shirley Burns. Mary Church Terrell by Mary Simpson. I'm playing Alice Paul. Naomi Sewell Richardson, played by Chris Romings. Carrie Chapman Cott, played by Jeannie Ellington. And Harry T. Byrne, we love Harry T. Byrne, by Ron Ellington. Then we will have the reading of the 19th Amendment and our toast to tenacity. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Maddie Stewart. Maddie is a member of our Sanibel League Board, and she's also a delegate to Vision 2020. Then I'll introduce you to Audrea Anderson. As the co-creators of this marvelous program, Maddie will give you a brief background about the origins of Toast to Tenacity. Audrea will introduce the Voices program and help raise our glasses to the 19th Amendment. Please do remember that when Act 1 begins, all of your audio and video will be muted. If you are not already muted until we reach the toast at the end, when you may again unmute your audio and video and we can all toast together. Maddie, I'm going to hand it to you.
Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you to Robin and to the board of the Sanibel League of Women Voters for inviting us to present Voices for Women's Suffrage at this Toast to Tenacity. I am a Florida delegate to Vision 2020, a national coalition of individuals and organizations dedicated to women's social, political, and economic equality. In 2010, Vision 2020 inaugurated a Toast to Tenacity as a way to celebrate and highlight the courageous and tenacious and very often overlooked heroes of women's suffrage. In 2017, my friend Audrea Anderson and I first introduced the Toast to Tenacity to Lee County. This is our 4th annual toast. Alice Paul, pictured here with her glass of grape juice held high, toasted the passage of the 19th Amendment exactly 100 years ago today, on August 26, 1920. Later in the program, as you heard, we'll have our own toast, but you do not have to drink grape juice.
And we won't.
And you won't, that's right. Thanks. It's a pleasure to have so many friends with us today. 68 so far, and I think we had 100 signed up, but you know, the vagaries of Zoom and whatever. Anyway, you're from across the country today, all the way from Texas, where my daughter is, and Maine, where Carol Gestwicki is. So it's great to have everybody here. This could never happen except for the beauty of Zoom. But actually, we're part of a much larger celebration. Across the country today, thousands of individuals and hundreds of organizations, all members of Vision 2020, are gathering virtually to celebrate the passage of the 19th and the heroes who made it possible. The programs will differ, but we all honor the tenacity of the suffragists. So today we're going to learn more about our shared history. Remember that image of Alice Paul we were just looking at? She may have appeared to be a conventional young woman, but Alice, the suffragists you will hear from today, and the thousands of others who came before and after her were anything but conventional. They were revolutionaries. They fought against the centuries-old white male-dominated power structure, and they fought for equal rights for all women. We hope that this history of the fight for the right to vote inspires and motivates each of us to keep working together for equality and justice for all. Now let me introduce you to Audria Anderson.
Thank you, Maddie. I am Audria Anderson, a member of the governing board of the Progressive Women of Southwest Florida and past president of the Fort Myers alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We are happy to be with you today. As we celebrate the passage of the 19th Amendment, I am honored to present Voices for Women's Suffrage, a piece that Maddie and I wrote and introduced in 2019. The voices you will hear today represent just a small group of the courageous women and men, both Black and white, who fought for our rights over a 70-year period. Several of the ladies in today's performance are members of the Fort Myers alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. It is an African-American sorority that was founded in January of 1913, and only 2 months later marched in the Great Suffragist Parade in Washington, D.C. for the right to vote. During the long struggle for the right to vote, Black women faced challenges of racism, even from many white suffragists, and especially among Southern women. Nevertheless, Black women persisted within the coalition. And today, Black women are the most loyal voting bloc for candidates who stand for equal rights and social justice. Remember, 96% of Black women voted for the woman candidate in the 2016 presidential election. Clearly, the sorority has continued its founder's legacy of fighting for equality and social justice. With Voices today, we honor those well-known and those too often overlooked by the history books. We hope this performance will help inspire momentum and motivation to build a future with no impediments to voting. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Voices for Women's Suffrage.
I am Abigail Adams. When my husband John was in Philadelphia with the other white men of privilege and property, writing the Declaration of Independence in 1776, I wrote to him and I said, "Remember the ladies, or we shall surely foment a rebellion and will not be bound by laws in which we have no say or voice or representation." He didn't listen. They wrote, "All men are created equal."
I am Sojourner Truth, an abolitionist and a women's rights activist. I escaped slavery and began a speaking and preaching crusade for human rights. I spoke to hundreds of audiences in Ohio, New York, Michigan, and Massachusetts, focusing in on women's rights, in particular, our right to vote. Often I would bring the house down with my rasping singing voice and my moving oration peppered with Bible truths. One of my quotes that went viral was, "I feel safe in the midst of my enemies, for that truth is all powerful and will prevail."
I'm Elizabeth Cady Stanton, an early leader of the women's suffrage movement. African American and white women across the nation formed women's clubs where they gained the knowledge, organizational, and oratorical skills that would serve us well in the rebellion for equal rights. I organized the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. The Declaration of Sentiments I wrote was our call for equal rights and a rallying point for feminists across the country. As a gifted orator and a fiery writer, I spoke at conventions, authored influential books on women's suffrage, and even wrote many of my dear friend Susan B. Anthony's speeches.
I am Frederick Douglass, icon of civil rights. I escaped slavery, taught myself to read and write, and became a leading national voice for human rights through my actions and my newspaper, The North Star. Later, I wrote, "Knowledge is the pathway from slavery to freedom." I worked closely with my friends Susan Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others in the abolition of slavery movement. And we worked just as passionately for women's suffrage. My compelling orations at Seneca Falls convinced the audience to include women's suffrage in the declarations of sentiments.
I'm Susan B. Anthony, a pioneer activist for human rights, starting with my work for women for the abolition of slavery. You know my work for women's suffrage. For 50 years, I gave the suffrage movement force and direction. That's why the 19th Amendment is often called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. My other social reform efforts also came to fruition. Women's right to own property separate from their husband, the woman's right to be a joint guardian of her children, the woman's right to enter into contracts, a girl's right to sit in a classroom alongside boys, and a woman's right to attend colleges and universities and learn alongside men. I dedicated my life to the struggle for human rights.
I am Mary Ann Shad Carey, a journalist, teacher, lawyer, and national newspaper publisher, where I promoted abolitionists of slavery and women's suffrage. In my day, newspapers were very influential. They were the only purveyors of news and important current issues. As a publisher, I provided strong editorial commentary and culture in my newspaper. As a journalist, I wielded strong influence in the abolition of slavery and later in the women's suffrage movement. I founded the Colored Women's Progressive Franchise, which advocated women's rights. I joined the National Women's Suffrage Association and worked with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Together, we testified for women's rights before the Judiciary Committee of the United States House of Representatives. None of us who began the rebellion for equal rights lived long enough to exercise our own right to vote. None of us could be certain that universal adult suffrage would be achieved. Those who came after us continued to struggle.
We are the pioneering voices behind the 19th Amendment.
I am Dr. Anna Julia Cooper, educator, writer, author, and political activist who advocated for civil rights and women's rights. In my day, I was known as the Black feminist. I established local organizations for women, young people. I created African Americans of the YW and YMCA to provide support for young Blacks moving from the South. These organizations helped to address issues involving education, housing, and unemployment, issues directly living. My first book, Voice of the South by a Woman of the South, calls for equal education for women and promoted my belief that educated African American women were key to uplifting the entire race. I lectured across the nation and internationally on topics of civil rights, education, and the status of women. I am the only woman of any color quoted in the passport. The cause of freedom is not the cause of a race, sex, or a class. It is called the very right of humanity.
I am Ida B. Wells Barnett, civil rights and women's rights activist, teacher, and journalist. I was nationally and internationally known for my incisive investigative journalism into the heinous crime of lynching. In Chicago, I was very active in the National Women's Club movement and traveled the speaking circuit advocating for women's suffrage. In the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C., instead of marching at the back of the line as I was directed, I insisted on marching with my Chicago delegation.
I am Mary Church Terrell, a national activist for civil rights and women's suffrage, orator, educator, and journalist. I am a founding member of the NAACP and a founding organizer of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. My relationship with Susan B. Anthony was a delightful, helpful friendship. I worked with Frederick Douglass on civil rights campaigns, organized Black women in America to fight against lynching and for educational reform. I picketed the Wilson White House for better treatment of Black veterans. I fought for women's suffrage and civil rights because I recognized I belonged to the only group in this country that has two such huge obstacles to surmount, both sex and race. I was recognized internationally as a leader for civil rights. My highest profile speech was delivered in Berlin, Germany at the International Congress for Women. I received a rousing ovation when I delivered my address, first in German, next in French, and lastly in English. I was the only Black woman present.
I am Alice Paul. While studying in England, I joined the suffragette movement there. From there, I learned the value of a militant headline. Headline grabbing protests and civil disobedience. In 1913, we organized the first Women's March in Washington, D.C. What was our goal? A constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. Our march of 8,000 strong brought 500,000 people out to support us, but some came to heckle and harass us. A near riot ensued. I continued organizing protests, and in 1917, 1,000 silent sentinels, women in white from across the nation, began 18 months of picketing the White House. We endured verbal and physical attacks. Instead of protecting our right to free speech and peaceful assembly, the police arrested us. We were held in deplorable conditions and suffered inhumane treatment. We were beaten and force-fed. This mobilized public opinion, producing greater awareness and sympathy for our cause. By 1918, President Wilson announced his support for women's suffrage and called for an amendment to the Constitution.
I am Naomi Sewell Richardson, one of 22 founders of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated on Howard University's campus in 1913. My sisters and I formed this sorority because we wanted to engage in community service and fight for human rights to improve the welfare and quality of life for humanity. 2 months after we organized, we joined the Women's Suffrage March of 1913 in Washington, D.C. That experience set the stage for our lives' work. First, we were relegated to the back of a parade of 8,000 strong. The violence from hecklers was frustrating and terrifying. But we persisted. Many of our parents asked us not to march because they feared for our safety. But we were passionate about our cause and held the DST banner high and marched anyway. The legacy of persistent and passion for social justice and human rights was passed down to the current generation of over 300,000 deltas in over 1,100 chapters around the world.
I am Carrie Chapman Catt. For more than 40 years, I was one of the most powerful and influential women behind the national suffrage movement. I worked tirelessly to pass the 19th Amendment in state legislature and was in Nashville, Tennessee on that historic day in August 1920. I founded the League of Women Voters in February 1920, 5 months before the ratification of the 19th Amendment, because I believed that every voter needs nonpartisan information and education about the critical issues of the day.
I'm Harry T. Byrne. On the 25th day of August 1920, a very hot day in many respects, I cast a swing vote in the Tennessee legislature that changed the course of U.S. history. It made the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution a reality. Of course, the night before the vote, I received a letter from my mother that said, "Harry, do the right thing by the ladies."
We are the voices that push the 19th Amendment across the finish line.
The 19th Amendment did become the law of the land in 1920, but it was not until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the American ideal, all people are created equal, was codified into law. Even today, 100 years later, there is still work to do. Inequities remain. Gerrymandering, poll closures in selected communities, purging of voter rolls, discouraging mail ballots during the pandemic, denying the vote to former felons, and other roadblocks to voting continue. Today, we may celebrate, but tomorrow we get back to work on equal rights for all. So everyone, please join us as we read in unison the words of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution.
The right
of citizens of the
United States to
not
vote
denied
and not be denied
or
denied
by
the United States or by any state on account of sex.
on account of sex.
On account of sex.
Now, let's raise our glasses, just as the suffragists did, to token this 100th anniversary.
Happy birthday. Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Yeah.
Yes.